All Ethan Brooks wanted was to prepare for his keynote speech in peace. He'd paid for the seat, earned his elite status, and followed every rule. But when a white VIP demanded his seat and the crew backed her up, Ethan faced a choice: give in quietly or stand his ground in front of a plane full of strangers. Would you have the courage to hold your seat when the world insists you don't belong there? If you believe dignity has no color and justice should fly first class, hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now let me take you back to the moment it all began. The aircraft cabin was unusually quiet for a Monday morning. Passengers filed in one by one, their carry-ons brushing against the seats, their expressions carrying the familiar blend of fatigue and anticipation. This was Sky High Airways Flight 238 to San Francisco, one of the airline's flagship routes, known for its luxury service and high-profile clientele. In Seat 2A, Ethan Brooks adjusted his briefcase under the seat in front of him and opened his tablet. He wasn't just another first-class passenger. At 42, Ethan was the founder and CEO of Nexus Logic, a $3 billion AI company specializing in ethical customer service technology. A self-made man who'd grown up on the south side of Chicago, Ethan had earned every inch of success not by demanding attention, but by quietly commanding it. He'd chosen Seat 2A for a reason: extra legroom, better Wi-Fi signal, and proximity to the front exit. Perfect for reviewing notes before his keynote at the Global Ethics and Technology Conference. A Platinum Elite member. Early check-in, confirmed seat. No reason to expect anything other than a smooth flight. That was until Claire Dawson approached his row. "Excuse me, sir," she said with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I believe there's been a mix-up. We'll need you to relocate so we can accommodate one of our regular VIPs." Ethan looked up, puzzled but polite. "I'm sorry, but this is Seat 2A, and it's on my boarding pass," he replied, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out his wallet and presented his platinum member card and printed boarding pass without hesitation. Claire took both with a brief glance and nodded, her expression tightening. "Yes, I see that. But Miss Sloan always sits here on this route. She's one of our most loyal passengers. We were hoping you'd be willing to switch." Ethan raised an eyebrow, still composed. "With all due respect, Miss Dawson," she answered. "Miss Dawson, I selected this seat weeks ago. I have a keynote to finalize and prefer not to be moved. I trust the airline honors assigned seating for all members, not just the familiar ones." Claire's smile faltered slightly, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the aisle. A woman's voice, sharp and well-practiced. "I always sit there. Everyone on this route knows it." The speaker was Madeline Sloan, immaculately dressed in a tailored cream suit, her hair swept into a tight chignon. She stood just behind Claire, her hand tapping against the face of her diamond-studded watch. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then returned to his tablet without saying a word. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A few pretended not to watch, but their eyes lingered. Claire leaned in again, her voice softer this time. "Sir, I understand your concern, but perhaps we could make you more comfortable in another section. We want to avoid any unnecessary disruption." From across the aisle, a young man slowly angled his phone camera toward the interaction. Something about the tone, too familiar, too rehearsed, set off quiet alarm bells. And then it happened. As Madeline placed her designer handbag into the overhead bin above Seat 2B, she leaned forward just enough for only Claire to see. With practiced ease, she slid a folded stack of bills, 20s, maybe 50s, into Claire's uniform pocket. Her lips barely moved. "Thanks for handling this discreetly," she whispered, her voice low but audible to a few rows nearby. Claire didn't respond, but her face flushed. Ethan hadn't seen it, but someone else had. The phone camera captured every movement, and that's when the air in cabin first class changed. The story wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about something else. Something much older, much deeper, much harder to explain away. And in that moment, Ethan Brooks didn't know it yet. But by refusing to move from Seat 2A, he was about to shake an entire airline to its core. The hum of the cabin air faded beneath a quiet tension. Claire hadn't said another word since slipping the cash into her pocket. Her posture was stiff now, her smile replaced by a tight, unreadable line. She walked quickly toward the front of the cabin, disappearing behind the first-class curtain. Moments later, Another crew member emerged, this time a man. Richard Webb. He walked with the sharp precision of someone who expected compliance before conversation. His shoulders squared, chin lifted slightly, voice already firm before he reached the seat. "Sir," he said crisply, looking down at Ethan as if inspecting a problem, not addressing a person. "We've had a last-minute reassignment. I'm going to need you to move to an alternate seat immediately." Ethan looked up, eyes steady. "Excuse me, and you are?" "Richard Webb. I'm the senior flight supervisor on this leg." Ethan gave a polite nod. "Then you already know I'm a Platinum Elite member, and that this is my confirmed seat, 2A. I chose it specifically for the space and quiet. I have a keynote to finish preparing, and I'd prefer to remain where I am." Richard didn't blink. "This is an emergency reassignment. We reserve the right to adjust seating arrangements for operational needs." Ethan gently closed his tablet, laid it on the tray table, and reached once more into his jacket. With deliberate calm, he handed over his boarding pass and his membership card again. "I understand emergency protocols, but unless there's a safety issue, I don't believe you're authorized to displace a passenger without cause." The surrounding rows had quieted. Some passengers had begun to glance over, not openly, not yet, but with the kind of careful curiosity that simmers before someone hits record. Across the aisle, the young man with the phone had already begun filming. From somewhere near the back of first class, a voice murmured, "What's he making a fuss about? It's just a seat." Someone else answered softly, "No, it's the principal." Meanwhile, Madeline Sloan remained standing in the aisle like royalty denied her throne. She let out a long, theatrical sigh and clutched her handbag to her chest. "This is becoming absurd," she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "I have a meeting the moment we land. I always sit in 2A on this flight. I don't understand why this is even a conversation." Claire returned just then, carrying a bottle of water and placing it in the drink holder beside 2B, as if rewarding loyalty or positioning her for the win. Richard's tone dropped, lower now, closer to a warning than a request. "Sir, I'm giving you the opportunity to cooperate voluntarily. Let's not escalate this." Ethan sat motionless, posture upright but relaxed. "Respectfully, Mr. Webb, the escalation didn't begin with me. It began when someone decided that loyalty was determined by skin tone, not by the airline's own records." A ripple moved through the cabin. Someone near the back whispered, "Did he just say that?" Another responded, "Good for him." Madeline pressed the back of her hand to her forehead as if overcome by distress. "I feel, I don't know, ignored, marginalized. This kind of treatment is, frankly, beneath this airline's standards." Her words dripped with irony, but she didn't seem to notice or care. From behind her, another passenger, a woman in her 60s, folded her arms and narrowed her eyes. She didn't say a word, but she didn't look away either. Ethan kept his gaze forward, his voice even. "I'm not here to create a scene. I'm simply staying in the seat I was assigned, the seat I paid for." Richard took a breath, clearly suppressing frustration. He stepped back, eyes flicking toward Claire. The two exchanged a glance that said more than words, and then he walked to the front, disappearing behind the curtain. What they didn't know was that nearly half a dozen phones were now recording. What they couldn't see was that on the ground, someone was already uploading footage to social media. What they didn't expect was that the man in seat 2A didn't just design systems that exposed bias. He was about to become the system's test case, in real time, 30,000 feet above the noise. And the silence in the cabin? It wasn't peace. It was pressure, waiting to break. The curtain at the front of the cabin rustled once, then parted. Captain Raymond Clark stepped into the aisle with the weight of authority on his shoulders. Mid-50s, gray streaks at his temples, and the quiet command of a man used to being obeyed without hesitation. His expression was neutral, but behind his eyes was a storm of pressure building from the crew, the schedule, and the whispered urgency of avoiding an incident. He stopped beside seat 2A. "Sir," he began, his voice even but laced with formality, "we've received reports from the cabin crew that you're refusing to comply with a seating reassignment. For the safety and comfort of all passengers, we need your cooperation." Ethan looked up from his seat, still calm, still composed. "With all due respect, Captain," he said, "I have not refused any reasonable request. I'm seated exactly where my boarding pass says. I'm a platinum member, and I checked in early. This seat was chosen for a reason. Captain Clark's tone hardened, shifting from request to warning. If you do not comply, we may have to remove you from this flight. We're asking one last time. The air felt thinner somehow. People who had been whispering now went still. Heads turned, but few faces showed emotion. Just that universal sense of discomfort people carry when something isn't right, but no one wants to be the first to say so. Ethan's hand moved slowly, purposefully. He reached into his pocket, not for a card, not for his ID, but for his phone. And this time he pressed record. I'd like to be very clear, he said, his voice calm but resonant as he held the phone up at chest level. I'm being threatened with removal for refusing to give up a seat that I legally reserved, paid for, and was assigned. Richard Webb, standing just behind the captain, stiffened. Claire paled. Captain Clark's eyes flicked to the phone. Sir, recording passengers and crew is against our policy, he said, voice tightening. Not against FAA regulations, Ethan replied smoothly. So long as I don't interfere with safety procedures, I'm within my rights to document this. And given how this is playing out, I believe documentation is necessary. It was in that moment, quiet but electric, that everything changed. Across the cabin, one woman lowered her sunglasses and looked directly at the captain. A man in row 3 leaned forward, speaking just loud enough to be heard. He's not wrong, that's his seat. I watched him board. No one said a word until that woman showed up. Another passenger added, I've been flying this route for 10 years. Never seen anyone moved like this before. Madeline Sloan let out a dramatic breath. Oh, so now I'm the bad guy? She muttered, eyes wide, looking around for sympathy. It didn't come. Claire shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. Richard folded his arms across his chest, eyes hardening. But even he could see it now. The tide was turning. Ethan never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He simply looked at the captain, steady and unflinching. If you're going to remove me, you'll have to explain, clearly, and on the record, why a law-abiding passenger is being punished for following the rules. The captain didn't respond right away. The silence was interrupted by a new sound, the slow, heavy steps of 2 uniformed men entering the cabin. Security. Every eye in first class turned to follow their approach. One held a tablet in hand. The other scanned the faces, locating the source of the disturbance. Claire moved aside. Richard stood taller. Madeline smiled faintly. And Ethan? He stayed exactly where he was, phone still recording, posture still proud, voice still steady. Because in that moment, Ethan Brooks wasn't just defending a seat. He was defending the right to belong, no matter what the world tried to say otherwise. The aisle was still. 2 security officers flanked Ethan Brooks as he stood from seat 2A, tall, unshaken, and dignified. He slipped his tablet into his bag, tucked his phone securely in his coat pocket, and straightened his jacket with the quiet grace of someone who had learned, long ago, how to carry himself through humiliation without letting it define him. Not a single word was spoken by the flight crew as he walked past them. Not an apology, not a glance. Passengers parted in silence. Some lowered their heads. Others couldn't look away. A few still clutched their phones, recording. But no one stopped it. Ethan stepped off the aircraft into the boarding tunnel, escorted not like a VIP, not like a respected professional, but like a problem that had been removed. And still, he said nothing, until a voice called out behind him. Excuse me, sir. Wait. He turned. A young woman in her late 20s was jogging down the jet bridge, clutching her carry-on in one hand and her phone in the other. Her face was flushed, not with embarrassment, but with something sharper. Righteous disbelief. It was the woman from across the aisle. I had to follow you, she said breathlessly. My name's Sophia Lane. I couldn't sit there and watch that happen and say nothing. She held out her phone. I recorded the whole thing, from the moment the flight attendant asked you to move. I got everything, her taking the money, the tone they used, how you stayed calm through all of it. Ethan blinked, not in surprise, but in recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when someone finally sees what you've seen your whole life. Thank you, he said quietly, accepting her phone so he could airdrop the video to his own. This may be very helpful. She nodded. If you need a witness, a statement, anything, I'm here. I saw what they did. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was wrong. They exchanged contact information. Her hands were still trembling, but her voice had steadied. And then Ethan did something that surprised even himself. He smiled. Not because what happened was over, but because, for the first time, he wasn't the only one who saw it. As Sophia walked away, Ethan stepped to the side of the terminal, opened his phone, and sent a brief text. To Elise Thompson. Just got removed from Flight 238. Need full legal team assembled within the hour. Also loop in PR. Time to document everything. Then another message. This one to airport security, requesting access to surveillance footage, because what no one on that plane knew was that Ethan's story had already begun long before Seat 2A. Inside the terminal's security room, a team pulled up footage at his request. The cameras had captured Ethan earlier that morning, long before he boarded. There he was, helping an elderly woman struggling with her rolling suitcase, gently walking her toward the gate and making sure she had the right flight. There he was, holding a door open for a young father with 2 toddlers. There he was at the cafe, smiling at the barista by name and tipping generously, not for attention, but because it was simply who he was. The same man who had been escorted off the plane as a disruption. Now with video footage in hand, from inside and outside the plane, Ethan began assembling the story that would soon shake an entire company from the inside out. He wasn't angry. He was ready. Because sometimes, the most powerful sound isn't a raised voice. It's a truth recorded in silence. At 8:43 a.m., the video reached 1 million views. By 9:10, it had surpassed 5. By 10, it was trending nationally with the hashtag #SeatToAjustice. Inside the sleek glass headquarters of Sky High Airways, the usually polished hum of corporate normalcy was unraveling at the seams. Phones rang off the hook. News anchors dissected every frame of the footage on morning television. Twitter was aflame. Investors were asking questions. Board members were texting each other in all caps. And at the center of it all, alone in his corner office, sat CEO Harold Chambers, staring blankly at the looping video on his screen. First came the flight attendant's forced smile. Then the VIP passenger's folded bill. Then the supervisor's threat. And finally, the security escort of a calm, well-dressed black man who hadn't raised his voice once. Harold rubbed his temple, heart sinking. How the hell did this happen? He picked up the phone to call PR. Janice, we need a statement. Something about miscommunication, standard protocol. But Janice's voice came through, unsteady. Sir, we have a bigger issue. What now? He snapped. Have you looked at the manifest for that flight? No. Why? There was a pause, one that made Harold sit up straight. Because the passenger who was removed wasn't just a platinum member. Another pause. This one longer. His name is Ethan Brooks. Silence. Harold blinked. You mean the Ethan Brooks? Yes, sir. Founder and CEO of Nexus Logic. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Nexus Logic, the very tech company Sky High had been in talks with for months. The company they hoped would modernize their outdated customer service systems, overhaul their AI infrastructure, and potentially save them millions in losses. The deal on the table? A $50 million partnership. A game changer. And now? Harold slowly sank back into his chair, watching the footage again, this time through different eyes. The calmness, the precision, the composure. They hadn't just removed a man from Seat 2A. They had removed the man who held their future in his hands. At 10:34 a.m., his assistant burst in without knocking, tablet in hand. Sir, his team just requested an emergency shareholder meeting. Immediate attendance. All executives. Full board. Harold stared at the screen once more. And as the video looped again, Madeline slipping cash, Claire looking away, Richard's threat ringing through the aisle, he whispered, almost to himself, they just humiliated the one man who could have saved us. The executive boardroom of Sky High Airways had never felt this cold. Though the floor-to-ceiling windows let in warm spring sunlight, no one in the room noticed. The long oak table was surrounded by board members, legal counsel, and department heads, some in suits, others in golf polos and weekend sweaters, hurried in from brunches, family picnics, and flights of their own. At the head of the room sat Harold Chambers, CEO. But the eyes of the room weren't on him. They were on the man seated across from him, Ethan Brooks. Still in the same tailored navy suit from that morning, still calm, still composed, only now, Flanked by his executive team, legal counsel, and communications director, he was no longer the man asked to leave. He was the one in charge. Without a word, Ethan placed a small remote on the table and pressed play. The lights dimmed. The screen at the front came alive. First, Claire Dawson, nervously asking Ethan to move just this once. Then Madeline Sloane's voice. "I always sit there." Next, the folded bills slipped with practiced ease into Claire's pocket. Cut to Richard Webb leaning in with that smug condescension. "Let's not make this difficult." Then, Captain Clark, eyes averted, refusing to intervene. And finally, the security escort, silent, clinical, and wrong. Nobody in the room spoke. Some shifted in their chairs, a few lowered their eyes. When the screen went black, the silence remained, for a long, heavy beat. Ethan placed the remote down with care and leaned forward. "I don't need to explain what you just saw," he said. "It explains itself." Harold cleared his throat, voice raspy. "Mr. Brooks, on behalf of everyone here, please accept our sincerest—" "I'm not here for apologies," Ethan interrupted, calm but firm. "I'm here for accountability." His words hung in the air like a gavel strike. "I've withdrawn Nexus Logic's proposal to partner with your airline, effective immediately." Murmurs rippled through the boardroom. Harold sat back, stunned. "But more importantly," Ethan continued, "as your largest individual shareholder, I'm exercising my rights to call for immediate termination of 3 employees, Claire Dawson, Richard Webb, and Captain Raymond Clark." He paused. His voice, still measured, grew colder. "This isn't just about what they did to me. It's about what they represent. A culture of entitlement, silence, and selective service that you've allowed to thrive under your name." Someone near the end of the table tried to speak, but was silenced with a look from the board chair. Harold swallowed hard. "Mr. Brooks, we understand your position. But perhaps we could consider suspensions instead? Internal review? Fair." "This is fair," Ethan replied, not raising his voice. "You saw the footage. You saw the bribe. You saw the bias." He looked around the room. "You cannot change what you refuse to confront, and you cannot rebuild what you won't first tear down." The board chair cleared her throat. "In light of the circumstances," she said slowly, "we'll move to a vote." One by one, hands went up around the table. First hesitant, then decisive. Unanimous. All 3 employees terminated, effective immediately. Harold exhaled, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like a reckoning. Ethan rose from his chair and gathered his things without fanfare. Before walking out, he turned one last time. "You had a chance to partner with a company built to prevent this very thing," he said. "Instead, you gave us a live demonstration of why our work is necessary." And with that, he walked out, not just of the room, but into the next phase of justice. Because for Ethan Brooks, this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring a standard that should never have been broken. 3 weeks had passed since the boardroom vote. The headlines had cooled, the hashtags had faded, but Ethan Brooks was far from done. For him, justice was never just about consequences. It was about conversion. It was about showing the world that people, when given the chance, could confront their biases, learn, and change. And so, he made a call. To Sky High's leadership, to its new compliance team, to its shareholders. He called it the Second Path, a voluntary but intensive rehabilitation program developed in partnership with Nexus Logic's behavioral science team. A structured journey through personal reflection, bias awareness, empathy training, and historical context. Not a corporate checkbox, but a mirror held up, long and steady. At the heart of that first cohort, Claire Dawson, Richard Webb, Captain Raymond Clark. Each had a choice, walk away in silence or walk through the fire of accountability. They all chose to stay. It wasn't easy. Claire, once proud of her poise under pressure, broke down in the very first session. "I knew what I was doing was wrong," she admitted, "but I told myself I was just following protocol. I thought being quiet meant being neutral. But now I see, silence can be violent too." Richard took longer. He spent the first few days defensive, arms crossed, jaw tight, but as the sessions dug deeper, into childhood conditioning, workplace culture, and unspoken hierarchies, his walls began to crack. "I never used slurs," he said one afternoon. "I thought that meant I wasn't racist. But bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers in how you treat someone, how quickly you dismiss them." Captain Clark, a man who had flown through storms and emergency landings, found himself grounded in a very different way. "I always believed I was fair," he said, But fairness without courage is cowardice. I watched it happen, and I said nothing. That's on me. Their progress wasn't linear. There were relapses, frustrations, even anger. But there was also something else, growth, and Ethan was there in person to witness it. He visited sessions unannounced, not to shame, not to intimidate, but to listen, to reflect, to hold them accountable without dehumanizing them. His presence changed the room, because it's hard to hold on to hate when the person you wronged is sitting across from you, calm, composed, and willing to offer you a second chance. The Second Path program didn't stop with those three. It expanded, first across Sky High, then into their new hire onboarding, then into continuing education for all departments. Every Sky High employee, from gate agents to senior executives, would complete the program. Flight schedules were adjusted, terminals were converted into learning centers. Planes were grounded for 48 hours, an unprecedented pause in airline history to prioritize culture over profit. Passengers noticed, reviews soared, customer satisfaction scores reached all-time highs. But more than that, there was a shift in atmosphere, an ease, a sense that dignity no longer had to be earned on boarding. It was given, freely. 6 months later, at a press conference attended by national media, Ethan stood behind a simple podium bearing the Sky High logo, reborn and renewed. He wore no tie, just an open collar and the same quiet strength he carried through every room he entered. "I'm not here today because I was humiliated," he said. "I'm here because something beautiful came from it." He paused, letting the moment settle. Sky High chose to confront itself, to look in the mirror and not flinch. That takes courage, that takes humility, that takes leadership. He looked out across the room, at reporters, at Sky High employees, at Claire, Richard, and Captain Clark seated near the front. And that's why today I share this not as a warning, but as a declaration. He reached into his jacket and unfolded a single sheet of paper. Justice is not just punishment. Justice is transformation. It's not only about removing what's broken, but rebuilding what's better. Justice is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a new one. The room stood in silence for a moment. Then came the applause, not the polite kind, but the full-bodied, heartfelt kind that says, "We see what you've built, and we believe in what comes next." And as Ethan stepped down from the podium, the world didn't just see a man who refused to move from seat 2A. They saw a man who'd turned a moment of quiet injustice into a movement loud enough to reach the sky. Some stories don't end with justice. They begin with it. Ethan Brooks didn't fight for attention. He fought for something far more powerful, the right to be seen, the right to belong. And that fight, it didn't end at seat 2A. It echoed through an entire system. Because injustice isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, in looks, in silence, in the way people look away when they should speak up. But not this time. This time, silence met its match. And what followed wasn't revenge. It was redemption. So I ask you, the one listening now, if you saw someone being pushed aside, would you stay quiet, or would you be the voice they needed? If this story moved you, share it. Let it echo. Let it grow. Because justice isn't just about the end of a story. It's about the beginning of who we choose to become.